Have you ever poured your entire soul into building a home, only to be told you were just part of the furniture? What happens when the person who promised to see you forever suddenly looks right through you, mistaking your quiet strength for absence, your selfless love for a lack of ambition? This is the story of Sarah, a woman who was the silent, beating heart of her family, and what she discovered when that heart was left to beat alone in an empty house. It's a story about the devastating silence that follows a slammed door and the unexpected strength that can be found in the echo. On a crisp Friday morning, the air in the house was already buzzing with an unfamiliar energy. Mark, her husband of 12 years, was packing a small unicorn-themed suitcase for their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He did it with a performative flourish, a man playing the part of a devoted father for an audience of one. Sarah stood in the doorway of Lily's room, a dish towel still clutched in her hand, a remnant of a breakfast she'd made and he'd barely touched. "It'll be great," Mark announced, not looking at her. "Just me and my best girl. A little father-daughter bonding at the lake house." "And you," he finally turned, his eyes sweeping over her with a detached appraisal. "You'll get a break. 48 hours all to yourself. No lunches to pack, no laundry to fold. You can finally relax." His words were meant to sound like a gift, a generous reprieve from the daily grind. But to Sarah, they landed like stones. Relax? Her life wasn't a chore to be escaped, it was a tapestry she wove with love and intention every single day. The threads were the meals, the schedules, the bedtime stories, the kissed knees, the endless, invisible tasks that made their house a home. He saw the labor, but he had long stopped seeing the love that fueled it. He saw a tired woman in an apron, not the architect of his comfort, the silent partner in all his successes. A knot of cold dread tightened in her stomach. "Okay," she said, her voice a little too quiet. "Have fun." She knelt to hug Lily, burying her face in her daughter's dandelion-scented hair. "Be good for Daddy, sweet pea." Lily giggled, oblivious to the current of tension passing between her parents. "We're gonna see ducks, Mommy." Mark cleared his throat impatiently. "All right, kiddo, let's hit the road." He ushered Lily out the door, and for a moment, Sarah was left standing in the sudden, jarring silence. He didn't kiss her goodbye. He didn't even look back. He just pulled the door shut, and the click of the latch sounded like a lock turning on a cage she hadn't realized she was in. The house, once a bustling universe of her own making, felt cavernous and cold. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. It was the sound of being left behind. The first few hours were a strange, disorienting void. Sarah moved through the rooms of her home like a ghost, her purpose suddenly stripped away. The usual rhythm of her day, the school run, the grocery list, the meal prep, the tidying up that was as constant and unnoticed as her own breathing, was gone. She stood in the kitchen, the heart of her domestic world, and felt like a stranger. The silence pressed in on her, amplifying the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a silence that should have been a luxury, but felt like a punishment. She tried to embrace it, as Mark had suggested. She ran a bath, pouring in expensive oil she'd been saving for a special occasion, but the water felt merely wet, not decadent. She picked up a book she'd been meaning to read for months, but the words swam before her eyes, unable to hold her attention against the rising tide of unease. Why did this gift of solitude feel so much like abandonment? She found herself cleaning, her hands moving on autopilot, wiping down counters that were already spotless, straightening cushions that were already plump. It was in Mark's study that the first real crack appeared in her forced composure. While dusting his immaculate desk, she noticed a small, crumpled receipt peeking out from under a stack of papers. It was from a new, ridiculously expensive restaurant downtown, a place they had talked about trying for their anniversary. The date on the receipt was from last Tuesday, a night Mark had told her he was working late to close a deal. The bill was for two. 2 steaks, 2 glasses of the finest red wine, 2 desserts. An intimate, celebratory meal she had not been a part of. A cold shiver traced its way down her spine. It wasn't just the lie, it was the casualness of it, the ease with which he had erased her from his evening, from his celebration. She sank into his large leather chair, the one that always smelled faintly of his cologne and ambition. She thought about his recent behavior, the clipped, one-word answers, the way his phone was always angled away from her, the growing emotional chasm between his side of the bed and hers. She had told herself it was stress from work. She had made excuses for him, absorbed his moods, and tried to make his life easier, believing that was her role, her duty as a supportive partner. But looking at the receipt, a different, harsher truth began to emerge. He wasn't just stressed. He was absent. He was living a life that ran parallel to hers, a life with celebratory dinners for two that did not include her. She sent him a text message. "Hope you and Lily are having a wonderful time. The house is so quiet without you." The reply that came back an hour later was a single, sterile word. K, not miss you, not wish you were here, just K. The single letter was more chilling than 1,000 cruel words. It was the sound of a door being bolted from the other side, a final, dismissive click. The dread in her stomach was no longer a knot, it was a stone, heavy and cold, sinking her deeper into the suffocating silence of her perfect, empty home. By Saturday afternoon, the silence in the house had become a physical presence, a heavy blanket smothering every room. Sarah had stopped trying to enjoy it. She now recognized it for what it was, the sound of her own irrelevance. Every corner of the home she had so lovingly curated now seemed to mock her. The family photos on the mantelpiece felt like relics from a bygone era, capturing smiles that no longer reached Mark's eyes. The scent of cinnamon and vanilla that usually warmed the kitchen felt like a ghost of a life that was already over. Unable to bear the quiet any longer, she picked up the phone and called the one person she knew would understand the language of a fractured heart, her mother, Eleanor. Eleanor, a widow for 5 years, lived with a quiet dignity that Sarah had always admired. She answered on the second ring, her voice a warm, steady anchor in Sarah's swirling sea of anxiety. "Sarah, darling. I was just thinking about you. How are you enjoying your peaceful weekend?" Sarah tried to form a cheerful reply, but the words caught in her throat. A single, choked sob escaped instead. On the other end of the line, Eleanor didn't fuss or panic. She simply waited, a testament to a mother's infinite patience. "Talk to me," she said softly. And so Sarah did. The words tumbled out, the dismissive way Mark had left, the hollow silence of the house, the coldness of his text, the gut-wrenching discovery of the restaurant receipt. She poured out all the anxieties she had been pushing down for months, the feeling of being unseen, of her love and effort being taken for granted, of slowly disappearing within her own marriage. Eleanor listened without interruption, her silence a comforting embrace through the phone line. When Sarah finally fell quiet, exhausted from the emotional torrent, Eleanor didn't offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. She didn't say, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." Instead, she asked a question, her voice gentle but sharp with a devastating clarity. "Sarah," she began, "when was the last time Mark really saw you? I don't mean the mother of his child, or the woman who runs his household. I mean you, the woman he fell in love with. The artist who put away her paints, the reader who set aside her books, the dreamer who packed away her own ambitions to make space for his." The question hung in the air, piercing through years of self-deception. Sarah couldn't remember. She had seamlessly merged her identity with her roles, believing that was the definition of love and sacrifice. She had become the foundation, the scaffolding, the invisible support system for his life, and in the process, she had let her own colors fade to gray. "A man who cannot see the value in his own home will search for treasure in ashes," Eleanor continued, her voice filled with a knowing sadness. "You are not invisible, my love. You have just been standing in the shadow of a man who is too consumed with himself to turn on the light. The problem isn't your worth. The problem is his inability to see it." Eleanor's words were not a comfort, they were a call to arms. They didn't soothe the wound, they cleansed it, preparing it to heal. For the first time, Sarah didn't feel like a victim of Mark's neglect. She felt a flicker of something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time: indignation. A quiet, powerful anger. It wasn't Mark who had made her invisible. She had participated. She had handed him the cloak of invisibility every morning when she chose his comfort over her own needs, his ambitions over her own dreams. The phone call ended not with tears, but with a newfound resolve hardening in Sarah's heart. The silence in the house no longer felt accusatory. It felt like a space waiting to be filled, not with the noise of her family, but with the sound of her own voice, a voice she was finally ready to reclaim. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy, expectant stillness. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in melancholy shades of orange and purple. Sarah sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, not reading, not watching television, just waiting. She heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the familiar sound of Mark's SUV. The car doors opened and closed, followed by the light, skipping footsteps of Lily and the heavy, deliberate tread of her husband. The key turned in the lock and the front door swung open. Lily burst in first, her face flushed with excitement and fatigue from the weekend away. "Mommy, we saw 100 ducks and Daddy let me have ice cream for breakfast," she chirped, throwing her arms around Sarah's legs. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, the simple, pure love a painful contrast to the suffocating tension that followed Mark into the house. He stepped across the threshold, and the atmosphere immediately grew dense and cold. He was carrying their bags, and he set them down with a thud that seemed to echo with a sense of finality. He didn't meet her eyes. His gaze flickered around the immaculate living room, a brief, almost surprised look on his face, as if he had expected to return to chaos. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. He looked exhausted, but it wasn't the happy exhaustion of a fun-filled weekend. It was a deep, soul-weary fatigue. The air between them was thick with everything left unsaid, a decade of unspoken resentments and quiet disappointments converging in this one terrible moment. "Did you have a good trip?" Sarah asked, her voice even and steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging within her. "It was fine," he replied curtly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she knew meant he was stressed and avoiding a difficult conversation. "Lily was great. I'm just tired." "Long drive," he offered the excuse like a shield, a flimsy barrier to keep her at a distance. He turned his back to her, heading towards his study. "I've got to check some emails before the week starts," he said over his shoulder. It was a dismissal, a clear signal that the weekend was over and he was retreating back into his own world, a world where she was increasingly unwelcome. Sarah watched him go, the image of his retreating back a familiar, painful sight. But this time, something was different. The hurt was still there, but it was now overlaid with the cold, hard clarity her mother's words had given her. She was no longer just a wife waiting for her husband's attention. She was a woman on the precipice of a life-altering truth. The dread that had been her constant companion for 48 hours had solidified into a cold certainty. This wasn't just a bad mood. This wasn't just work stress. This was the end of something. As she led a sleepy Lily upstairs to get ready for bed, a strange premonition guided her steps back down. She wasn't drawn to the kitchen or the living room, but to the formal dining room, a space they reserved for holidays and special occasions, a room of ghosts and memories. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the faint light from the hallway, empty except for one object placed precisely in the center. A single, plain manila envelope. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, what was inside. She walked towards the dining room table as if in a dream, each step feeling both heavy and weightless. The room was cold, preserved like a museum exhibit of a happy family that no longer existed. The high-backed chairs stood like silent, judgmental witnesses. In the center of the vast, polished expanse of the table, the manila envelope seemed to absorb all the light in the room. It lay there, stark and clinical, with her name, Sarah Donovan, typed on a crisp white label. There was no "to my wife," no handwritten note, just a formal, impersonal address. It was the kind of label used for business, for transactions, not for the dissolution of a life built together. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The paper felt cool and unnervingly smooth. For a moment, she just held it, the weight of it feeling impossibly heavy, a harbinger of a future she had never imagined. With a deep, shuddering breath, she tore open the flap. Inside was a thick sheaf of papers, held together by a metal clip. The top page was emblazoned with the seal of the county court and the bold, stark words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The legal jargon blurred before her eyes. Petitioner, respondent, irreconcilable differences. The phrase irreconcilable differences felt like a cruel joke. Their differences were not irreconcilable. They were just unacknowledged. Her love versus his indifference. Her dedication versus his detachment. Her entire world reduced to a legal boilerplate. She sank into one of the dining chairs, the papers spread out before her like an autopsy report of their marriage. She read through the clauses, her mind struggling to process the cold, transactional language. Division of assets, custody arrangements for Lily, spousal support. It was all there, laid out with the sterile precision of a business deal. He had clearly been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The consultations with a lawyer, the careful preparation of these documents, all happening in the secret spaces of his life, like that dinner for two. The weekend trip with Lily hadn't been a bonding experience, it had been an alibi. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver to get her out of the way so he could deliver this final, devastating blow without having to face her immediate reaction. He hadn't wanted to see her tears or hear her questions. He had wanted to return to a decision that was already made, a verdict already delivered. The love, the laughter, the promises, the shared dreams, all of it had been rendered meaningless, condensed into this stack of paper on a cold, empty table. The pain was immense, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. But beneath the tidal wave of grief, the small, hard flicker of indignation that her mother had ignited began to glow brighter. He hadn't just decided to leave her, he had done it in the most cowardly way possible. He had judged her, found her wanting, and sentenced her without a trial. He had treated the end of their marriage like a corporate layoff, a simple administrative task. The shock began to recede, replaced by a slow, rising tide of pure, unadulterated anger. Her heart, which had been breaking just moments before, began to mend itself with a new, stronger material. It was the steel of resolve. She gathered the papers from the table, the sharp edges feeling like weapons in her hands. She walked out of the cold, silent dining room and down the hall to his study. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of light cut through the darkness. She could hear the soft, rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. She didn't knock. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mark looked up, startled, his face illuminated by the glow of his monitor. He saw the papers in her hand, and his expression shifted from surprise to a kind of weary resignation. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, the posture of a man readying himself for an unpleasant but necessary task. He didn't look guilty. He looked tired of hiding. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "I was going to talk to you about it tomorrow." The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it almost made her laugh. "Were you?" she asked, her own voice dangerously quiet. She walked to his desk and placed the papers down in front of him, right on top of his keyboard. "Or were you going to let me find this and then hide in here until I cried myself to sleep?" He flinched at her words, a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossing his face before he shuddered it away. He leaned back in his chair, adopting a defensive, almost defiant posture. "Look, this isn't easy for me either," he began, the classic opening line of a man who has made a profoundly selfish decision. "I'm just not happy, Sarah. I haven't been for a long time. I need something more. The word was a whip crack in the quiet room. "What is more, Mark? A dinner at a restaurant you lied about? A life without the woman who has dedicated every waking moment to building this one for you?" His jaw tightened. The mention of the restaurant confirmed his suspicions that she knew more than he thought. His defensiveness hardened into blame. "It's not about the dinner," he said, his voice rising. "It's about the fact that my life has become this. Predictable. Stale. You're wonderful, Sarah. You're a great mother, but you're comfortable. You're safe. I need a challenge. I need to feel alive again." There it was. The accusation she had been sensing for years, finally spoken aloud. Her comfort was a flaw. Her stability was a cage. Her love was not a prize to be cherished, but a sedative he needed to escape. He was the cynical gatekeeper of their marriage, and he had just deemed her unworthy of passing through to his next chapter. For a moment, the sheer arrogance of his statement stunned her into silence. He mistook her silence for defeat. But it wasn't defeat. It was the calm before a storm. The years of swallowing her own feelings, of prioritizing his happiness, of making herself smaller to fit into the box he had built for her, it all came rushing to the surface, not as a torrent of tears, but as a laser-focused, ice-cold fury. Her chin lifted. Her eyes, which he had so often overlooked, now met his with an intensity that made him physically recoil. "You think I am the absence of a challenge," she said, her voice low and trembling, not with weakness, but with a power she hadn't realized she possessed. "My entire life is a challenge you were too blind to see. My challenge was believing that the man I married still existed somewhere underneath the selfish stranger sitting in front of me. My challenge was raising our daughter while my partner emotionally checked out. My challenge was running this entire world for you, so you would have the luxury of being bored with it." Mark stared at her, genuinely taken aback. He had expected tears, pleading, maybe even yelling. He had not expected this chilling, articulate dissection of his own character. He had not expected this stranger, this formidable woman standing where his quiet, compliant wife used to be. For the first time that night, a sliver of uncertainty pierced his self-assured armor. Sarah wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and a decade of silent observation came pouring out, not as accusations, but as facts. "You want a challenge, Mark," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "Try managing Lily's doctor's appointments, her playdates, and her school projects while also remembering your mother's birthday and making sure your dry cleaning is picked up on time. Try creating a grocery list that accounts for everyone's preferences and a budget that never breaks. Try soothing a nightmare at 3 a.m. and still having the energy to make a perfect pot of coffee for a husband who doesn't even say thank you." She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on his desk, claiming the space that had always been exclusively his. "I was not your safe option. I was the architect of the life you took for granted. I was the engineer of the peace you found so boring. I was the COO of this family, a job with no salary, no sick days, and no recognition. And you, in your profound ignorance, mistook my competence for a lack of complexity. You confused my love for a lack of ambition." Every word was a carefully aimed dart, and they all hit their mark. The self-pity on Mark's face began to curdle into confusion, then a dawning horror. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time in years. Not as an extension of himself, not as the wallpaper of his life, but as a separate, powerful entity whose strength he had catastrophically underestimated. The more he had been searching for outside his home was standing right in front of him, and he had just handed her divorce papers. "I was the foundation you built your entire career on," she said, her voice softening now, but with a sorrow that was somehow more damning than her anger. "I handled every crisis, every detail, every emotional loose end so that you could be Mark Donovan, the brilliant deal-maker. I was the reason you had the freedom to seek your challenges. I was your greatest challenge, Mark. And your greatest failure is that you were too cowardly to even try to meet it." He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to apologize, but no words came. What could he say? She had stripped away all his justifications, leaving only the ugly, selfish truth. He had dismantled his own world out of boredom, breaking the most valuable thing he had ever possessed because he had forgotten how to appreciate it. He looked at the woman before him, her eyes clear and steady, and realized with a sickening lurch that he had not just ended his marriage. He had lost the best part of himself. The quiet, comfortable woman was gone, and in her place stood a queen, surveying the ruins of a kingdom he had foolishly, carelessly burned to the ground. Sarah looked at her husband, at the crumbling facade of his confidence, and felt no triumph. There was no satisfaction in his defeat, only a profound and hollow sadness for what they had lost, for the man he had failed to be. She had said everything she needed to say, not for him, but for herself. She had reclaimed her own narrative from the dismissive, hurtful one he had tried to write for her. Straightening up, she picked up the divorce papers from his desk. She didn't rip them up in a fit of rage. She held them with a calm resolve. "Thank you," she said, and the words were so unexpected that he looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "Thank you for making this easy," she clarified, her voice devoid of bitterness. "You've shown me exactly who you are and exactly what I am worth to you. There's no ambiguity left. There's nothing left to fight for." With that, she turned and walked out of the study, leaving him sitting alone in the glow of his computer screen, surrounded by the sterile architecture of a life he now realized was empty. She didn't go to their bedroom to weep. She went to the living room, took out her phone, and dialed her mother's number. "Mom," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's over." "He served me with papers." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Eleanor's voice, firm and resolute. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. We'll handle this together." True to her word, Eleanor arrived, not with tissues and sympathy, but with a thermos of strong tea and a fierce, protective light in her eyes. She was the catalyst Sarah needed, the perceptive authority who didn't see a victim, but a warrior preparing for a new battle. They sat at the kitchen table, the epicenter of Sarah's old life, and began to chart the course for her new one. Eleanor, with her practical wisdom, helped Sarah see beyond the immediate pain. She was the one who said, "Grief is a visitor, Sarah. Don't let it become a resident." Together, they made a list. Not of resentments, but of actions. Find a lawyer. Secure her finances. Look for a new place to live for her and Lily. Each item on the list was a stepping stone out of the wreckage. Sarah felt a profound shift within herself. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. For years, her life had been defined by Mark's needs, his schedule, his moods. Now, for the first time, she was the sole author of her own story. She was moving from the obscurity of being Mark's wife into the clear, bright light of her own power. The next morning, while Mark was still asleep, Sarah packed a bag for herself and Lily. She moved with a quiet efficiency he had always taken for granted, but this time, it was for her own benefit. She wrote a simple note and left it on the kitchen counter, next to his coffee machine. "I have taken Lily to her grandmother's. My lawyer will be in contact with yours." It was as simple and as final as his manila envelope had been. Driving away from the house she had poured her soul into, she didn't look back. She saw the future ahead of her, not as a terrifying void, but as a blank canvas. And for the first time in a very long time, she remembered that she was an artist. She had just forgotten what it felt like to hold the brush. In the weeks that followed, Mark's carefully curated life began to unravel with shocking speed. He had imagined his new bachelor existence as a sleek, exciting adventure, free from the mundane constraints of domesticity. The reality was a pathetic, chaotic mess. He had thought that running a household was simple, a series of tasks that just happened. He quickly learned that it was a complex, relentless machine, and Sarah had been its brilliant, tireless engineer. The first casualty was time. He was constantly late for work because he couldn't manage to get Lily dressed, fed, and out the door on schedule. He'd forget it was crazy sock day at school or that a permission slip was due. The house, once a sanctuary of order and calm, descended into a state of perpetual disarray. Dishes piled up in the sink, laundry overflowed from the baskets, and a thin layer of dust settled on every surface. He'd come home from an exhausting day at work not to a peaceful haven, but to a second shift of chores he was hopelessly ill-equipped to handle. His work, the very thing he had prioritized over his family, began to suffer. He was distracted, exhausted, and his performance plummeted. His boss, who had once praised his focus, now commented on his frazzled appearance and missed deadlines. The challenge he had craved was now a suffocating avalanche of responsibilities he had never even seen before. He tried to hire a cleaner, but they didn't know how he liked his shirts folded. He ordered takeout, but it wasn't the same as the healthy, thoughtful meals Sarah had prepared. He realized, with a growing sense of panic, that Sarah hadn't just been his wife. She had been his life support system. He had thought she was the anchor holding him back, when in fact, she had been the anchor holding him steady in the storm. The more he had desperately sought turned out to be an illusion, a mirage created by his own ego. The comfortable, stale life he had so carelessly discarded was, he now saw, a masterpiece of love, effort, and grace. He started seeing ghosts of Sarah everywhere, in the perfectly organized pantry she had left behind, in the scent of her favorite candle that still lingered in the air, in Lily's sad, questioning eyes when she asked when they were going to see Mommy again. The full weight of his folly crashed down on him. He had been a king who had traded his kingdom for a handful of dust. Overcome with regret, he drove to Eleanor's house, the divorce papers he had so arrogantly served now feeling like a confession of his own idiocy. He found Sarah in the garden with Lily, both of them laughing as they planted new flowers. She looked different. Her hair was cut in a new style, she wore a simple dress, and her face, free from the constant strain of trying to please him, was radiant. She looked happy. She looked free. He approached her hesitantly, a man pleading for a pardon. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with a humility he had never known. "I was a fool. I was wrong. About everything. I didn't see you. Please. Can we talk? Can we try to fix this?" He looked from her to the thriving garden, a vibrant symbol of the new life she was building without him, and for the first time, he understood the true meaning of loss. Sarah looked up at Mark, her hands covered in rich, dark soil. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the genuine regret etched on his face. A year ago, this moment, his apology, his plea for reconciliation, would have been everything she ever wanted. It would have been the validation she craved, the proof that her love had not been in vain. But standing there, in the warm sunlight of her mother's garden, surrounded by the new life she was cultivating for herself and her daughter, his words landed differently. They were no longer a lifeline she needed to grab, they were just the echoes from a life she had already left behind. She calmly wiped her hands on a towel, her movements deliberate and sure. She was not the same woman he had left in that silent house. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned a profound and painful lesson about her own worth. "You're right," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were a fool. And you didn't see me." She paused, letting the truth of her words settle between them. "But the problem was never that I was invisible. The problem was that you weren't looking. You were so busy searching for something more out there that you failed to see the universe you already had right here." She gestured to Lily, who was now chasing a butterfly, her laughter like tiny bells in the afternoon air. "My worth was never something for you to grant me or take away with a set of divorce papers, Mark. It was always there. I'm just sorry it took me this long, and losing you this way, to see it for myself." There was no anger in her voice, only a deep, settled peace. His apology was for him, not for her. She had already found her own closure in the act of choosing herself. "I can't go back," she said finally. "The home you destroyed cannot be rebuilt with apologies. I am building a new one now, for me and for Lily. A smaller home, perhaps, but one where the foundation is made of self-respect. And in this home, everyone is seen." She gave him a final, sad smile, a farewell to the man he was and the man he could have been. Then she turned her back on him, walked over to her daughter, and scooped her up into a hug. Mark stood there for a long time, a solitary figure watching the family he had thrown away. He finally understood that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost the heart of his world, and it was a loss entirely of his own making. So, what can we learn from Sarah's story? We learn that true value is never determined by someone else's inability to see it. It is not defined by applause or acknowledgement or a thank you. Your worth is intrinsic. It is in the love you give, the effort you make, the silent strength you show every single day. Do not let anyone make you feel invisible. Do not mistake your kindness for weakness or your dedication for a lack of dreams. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is to walk away from a table that is no longer set for you and build your own. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own incredible worth. And comment below with a time you discovered your own strength in a moment of difficulty. Remind the world and yourself that you are seen, you are valued, and you are more powerful than you know.